For more than half a century, foreign corporations walked into Africa, took its gold, and left the people of Burkina Faso with little more than poverty and fear. Everyone thought that this system would last forever. No one believed that the men in expensive suits, the executives who lived like kings off African soil, could ever be touched. Until one day everything changed. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the streets filled with the roar of military trucks. Soldiers in full gear blocked intersections, their weapons pointed skyward. And then in front of stunned citizens, the unthinkable happened. The most powerful foreign mining executives were placed in handcuffs and led away. The crowd gasped, some cheered, others prayed in silence. It was the kind of scene people had only imagined in whispers. Yet now it was real. Behind this extraordinary move stood a single man, Ibrahim Traoré. At just 36 years old, he became the face of defiance against a system that had drained his country for generations. To some, he is a hero, finally defending the nation's dignity. To others, he is a reckless risk-taker who may push Burkina Faso into dangerous territory. Among the people watching that day was a market vendor, a mother of 3 who looked at her children and said quietly, "Maybe this time our future will not be stolen." But even in that moment of hope, her eyes betrayed fear. Because in Africa, bold actions come with heavy consequences. This is not only a story about Burkina Faso, it is a story about Africa's fight for sovereignty, about the price of justice, and about the fragile line between courage and catastrophe. History is not written in silence. It is written in moments like this when nations decide whether to bow or to stand. As you listen, ask yourself, is Ibrahim Traoré the man who can truly change Africa, or will his gamble cost his country everything? The day of the arrests began like any other in Ouagadougou, but by sunset, the entire nation and the world was watching. Long before the first images appeared on television, ordinary citizens felt something unusual. Military trucks rolled through neighborhoods where children usually played soccer in the dust. Roadblocks went up at key intersections. Soldiers stood guard with heavy weapons rarely seen outside the battlefield. There was tension in the air, a silence broken only by the steady hum of engines and the clipped commands of officers. By mid-morning, the rumors spread like wildfire. The government was preparing to confront the foreign mining giants who had dominated Burkina Faso's resources for decades. These companies, mostly based in Europe and North America, controlled nearly 3/4 of the nation's gold production. For the average Burkinabé, that gold had never meant better schools, more hospitals, or safer streets. Instead, it left behind open pits, polluted water, and entire villages forced to relocate. For years, people whispered about the unfair deals signed under weak governments, but no one believed anything could change. Ibrahim Traoré had promised something different. Since taking power, he spoke often about sovereignty, dignity, and protecting Africa's wealth for Africans. Many thought these were just words rhetoric to inspire the young while leaving the old system intact. But on this day, those words turned into action. At 11 a.m., in a heavily guarded government building, security forces surrounded a group of foreign executives attending what they thought was a routine meeting. Instead of walking out with contracts in hand, they were placed under arrest. Witnesses later described the disbelief on their faces, men who once commanded empires of gold, now standing speechless as handcuffs clicked shut around their wrists. The arrests were not isolated. Across the capital, simultaneous operations targeted company headquarters, supply depots, and even private residences of senior officials tied to the mining industry. By the afternoon, at least a dozen foreign executives were in custody, along with several local intermediaries accused of corruption. It was a sweeping, coordinated effort that required months of planning, and the loyalty of the military, a sign that Traoré's grip on power was stronger than many outsiders had assumed. For the people of Burkina Faso, the arrests were shocking, but not entirely unwelcome. Crowds gathered outside government buildings, craning their necks for a glimpse of the captured elites. Some cheered, waving flags and shouting Traoré's name. Others stood silently, their faces heavy with worry. An old man leaned on his cane and muttered, "We have waited 50 years for this, but will it bring us peace or more suffering?" Among the onlookers was a young farmer named Issa, who had lost most of his land to a foreign mining project 2 years earlier. The company had promised jobs and development, but instead, his soil was poisoned and his family displaced. As he watched the arrests unfold, Issa told a reporter, "This is the first time I feel someone has listened to us, but I know the price will be high. They will not forgive us for this." His words captured the complicated emotions of the day, pride mixed with fear, hope laced with uncertainty. The numbers were staggering. Reports indicated that more than 1,200 soldiers were deployed across Ouagadougou to secure the city. Dozens of armored vehicles blocked access to foreign embassies and major hotels. Air patrols circled above, ensuring no escape was possible. For a country with limited resources, the scale of the operation was unprecedented. It sent a clear message. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a deliberate, calculated strike against decades of exploitation. But the reasons behind Traoré's timing remained unclear. Some analysts argued that he wanted to solidify his legitimacy at home, showing the people that he was serious about reclaiming Burkina Faso's wealth. Others believed he was preempting external pressure, acting before foreign powers could move against his government. Whatever the motivation, the impact was, immediate international phone lines buzzed, news agencies scrambled, and foreign investors panicked. The arrests reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso. Neighboring countries watched closely, wondering if their own citizens might soon rise against similar forms of exploitation. Activists across Africa hailed Traoré as a symbol of defiance, comparing him to past leaders who had dared to challenge global powers. But experts also warned of severe consequences: sanctions, economic isolation, or even covert attempts to destabilize his government. Inside Burkina Faso, daily life shifted in subtle but powerful ways. Markets closed early. Parents kept children at home, fearing unrest. At night, groups of men gathered in cafes debating what would come next. Some spoke with excitement, others with dread. One shopkeeper voiced what many felt: "Today we celebrated. Tomorrow we may pay." Through it all, Ibrahim Traoré remained silent, letting the images of handcuffed executives speak for themselves. His silence was deliberate, calculated to let the world interpret the moment without dilution. To his supporters, this was proof of strength. To his critics, a dangerous gamble. And so, as the sun set over Ouagadougou that evening, the people of Burkina Faso faced a new reality. Their leader had crossed a line that no one before him had dared to cross. The system of foreign dominance that had lasted for half a century had been shattered in a single day. But shattering the old order is only the first step. Building a new one is far more difficult. The question now lingered in the air, unspoken, but heavy: what would come next? But what truly caused this turning point? What pushed Traoré to risk everything in one decisive move? What truly caused this turning point? Many inside Burkina Faso believed the moment had been building for months. Ibrahim Traoré had watched as foreign companies extracted billions of dollars worth of gold, while his people struggled with hunger, insecurity, and fear. Each day reports came across his desk: villages, displaced water sources, poisoned young men leaving the country because there was no work. For him, the arrests were not a sudden impulse, but the culmination of rising anger and a desire to show his people that their leader would no longer stand idle. The climax of this historic moment came not inside government offices but in the streets. As news spread, thousands poured into Ouagadougou's main squares. Some carried the national flag, waving it with pride. Others carried signs denouncing foreign exploitation, written hastily on cardboard. For older citizens, the sight of executives in handcuffs was surreal, like watching a long, painful chapter finally close. A retired schoolteacher said, "For 50 years, I taught children that our wealth should belong to us. Today, I finally saw someone act on those words. But not everyone celebrated with the same joy. Fear hung in the air, and with it, uncertainty. Families worried that foreign powers would retaliate. Shopkeepers whispered that sanctions could come within weeks. Religious leaders urged calm, reminding citizens that justice without stability could cost innocent lives. Inside homes, parents spoke quietly to their children, trying to reassure them, though their own voices trembled. At the heart of the reaction was a press conference held by Traoré himself. Dressed in military uniform, standing behind a wooden podium, he spoke plainly, "Burkina Faso belongs to its people. For too long we have been robbed. Today we stand up. This is not a war on the world. It is a defense of our dignity." His words drew thunderous applause from supporters gathered outside, but they also echoed across television screens, leaving foreign governments scrambling to interpret his intent. The international press broadcast the images around the globe. On one channel, a reporter described the scene as a revolution in plain sight. On another, analysts warned of looming instability in West Africa. The visuals were striking: long columns of armored vehicles, chanting crowds, and the unmistakable look of disbelief on the faces of detained executives. For global audiences, it was both shocking and unforgettable. Meanwhile, inside the country, reactions divided sharply. Young people in the capital rallied behind Traoré, praising his courage and vowing to defend him if foreign powers intervened. Rural villagers who had borne the brunt of mining operations sent messages of gratitude, saying that for the first time they felt their suffering had been acknowledged. But among the political elite, whispers of doubt grew louder. Some feared that Traoré had gone too far, jeopardizing international aid and risking military backlash. One of the most emotional reactions came from the families of soldiers deployed to secure the city. Mothers gathered outside army bases, clutching photographs of their sons, praying they would return unharmed. A widow of a soldier killed years earlier in a clash with armed groups said quietly, "If my husband were alive, he would have stood with Traoré. But I worry for the young men now. They may pay with their lives for decisions made in offices." Her voice captured the bittersweet mix of pride and dread that rippled through the population. On the streets, small clashes broke out between those celebrating and those urging caution. In one neighborhood, young men lit bonfires and sang patriotic songs. In another community, elders gathered people and warned them not to provoke chaos. Local radio stations were flooded with callers, some praising Traoré as a savior, others warning that Burkina Faso could be walking into a trap. The atmosphere was electric, unstable, and deeply human, a people caught between hope and fear. The government tried to channel this energy into unity. Ministers appeared on television urging calm and promising reforms that would finally direct the nation's wealth toward healthcare, education, and security. Yet behind the scenes, diplomats scrambled to prepare for international fallout. Rumors circulated that foreign embassies were quietly evacuating staff. The national airport reported unusual flight bookings, suggesting some elites were trying to leave before the situation worsened. The climax was not only emotional but also deeply visual. Images of handcuffed executives being led past crowds became symbols of defiance across Africa. Posters with Traoré's face appeared overnight in neighborhoods, painted with slogans like "Our gold, our future." Yet in the same city, graffiti also warned beware of chaos, reflecting the divided mood. For the ordinary, Burkinabé daily life became a stage for history. A young student recalled how his father, once skeptical of politics, sat in front of the television all night, watching the news in silence. A grandmother who had lived through coups and crises shook her head and said, "I have never seen anything like this." And for many, that mixture of disbelief and cautious pride defined the climax of this event. Still, questions loomed larger than answers. Would the arrests spark new opportunities for the people, or would they provoke foreign retaliation? Could Traoré maintain unity within his own ranks? Or would divisions in the military and government tear the nation apart? As dusk fell on Ouagadougou, the city was lit by streetlights and the flicker of televisions broadcasting Traoré's speech on repeat. Crowds eventually dispersed, but the energy remained. Everyone knew the world was watching, and that the next days would determine whether this moment became a triumph or a tragedy. And so the question lingered, pressing heavily on every mind. The people had risen. Their leader had acted, but would the world act in time? The streets of Ouagadougou had spoken, the nation had made its move. But as night descended, one question remained. Would the international community respond swiftly or stand by as history unfolded on its own? The morning after the arrests, Burkina Faso woke up to a new reality. The images of foreign executives in handcuffs had spread across the nation like wildfire. In villages where electricity was scarce, people gathered around battery-powered radios to listen to news bulletins. In the capital, televisions in small cafes replayed the same footage over and over. For a country long accustomed to silence and submission, this was a moment of shock and awakening. But beneath the surface, life was already changing, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were immediate and deeply personal. Markets in Ouagadougou opened late and closed early as shopkeepers feared unrest. Parents hesitated to send their children to school, worried that demonstrations could turn violent. Farmers complained that the usual delivery trucks failed to arrive, disrupting supply chains. Some families began to stockpile rice beans and cooking oil, uncertain of what the coming weeks would bring. In rural areas, whispers of shortages spread quickly, raising anxiety. The economic impact was felt within days. Several foreign companies suspended operations, pulling out expatriate staff and halting investments. This created an immediate wave of unemployment for local workers who depended on mining jobs to feed their families. A young man named Mamadou, who had been working at a gold processing plant, described his dilemma. "I was proud when I saw those men arrested. But the next day, I lost my job. Now, I don't know how I will provide for my children." His story reflected the paradox facing many Burkinabé: pride in reclaiming sovereignty mixed with fear of economic hardship. Beyond the job market, the humanitarian cost began to rise. Health clinics reported a sudden increase in patients worried about shortages of medicine, much of which had been imported through trade deals with foreign companies. In one village, a mother of 4 walked several miles to find fever medicine for her youngest child, only to return empty-handed. "We finally have dignity," she told a local journalist, "but will dignity cure my child?" Her words captured the painful contradiction many families were experiencing. The political consequences were equally profound. Inside the government, unity was fragile. Some ministers fully supported Traoré, praising him as a bold leader who had restored national pride. Others worried quietly, fearing sanctions and isolation. Tensions within the military were also evident. While many soldiers admired Traoré's decisiveness, some senior officers privately questioned whether he had jeopardized their security by provoking powerful foreign interests. A leaked report suggested that a small faction within the armed forces was debating whether continued loyalty to Traoré was sustainable in the long run. On the streets, political polarization deepened. Supporters organized rallies, chanting slogans like "Our gold, our future," and carrying portraits of Traoré. Opponents, however, began to gather in smaller groups, warning that the government was risking the country's survival. Some elders urged dialogue, fearing that escalating rhetoric could split communities apart. The atmosphere grew tense, with people avoiding political conversations, even among neighbors unsure of who could be trusted. The ripple effects spread into education and migration. Universities saw a wave of protests from students demanding that the government redirect gold revenues toward scholarships and infrastructure. At the same time, border officials reported an uptick in people trying to leave the country, some seeking safety abroad, others hoping to find work in neighboring states. Families were torn between hope for a brighter future at home and fear that staying might mean deeper poverty. Statistics painted a grim picture. Analysts estimated that the arrests could cut foreign investment by nearly 40% within the year, costing tens of thousands of jobs. Inflation began to climb as the national currency weakened against the dollar. A local newspaper headline captured the sentiment in bold letters, "Pride without bread." Yet, despite these hardships, many citizens expressed a willingness to endure suffering if it meant reclaiming sovereignty. A group of women in Bobo-Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's second-largest city, marched with empty cooking pots chanting, "We can eat less, but we will not be slaves." Their defiance highlighted a key reality. For many, the fight was not just about material wealth, but about dignity and self-determination. Internationally, political isolation loomed large. Rumors circulated that sanctions were being discussed in Western capitals. Development aid, which accounted for nearly half of Burkina Faso's budget, was suddenly uncertain. Diplomats worried that suspension of aid could devastate schools, hospitals, and food programs. At the same time, African leaders were divided. Some praised Traoré for his courage. Others feared his actions might destabilize the region and invite foreign intervention. Religious leaders, sensing the growing unease, called for unity. In churches and mosques, prayers were offered for peace. One pastor delivered a sermon that struck a chord. "We have prayed for justice, and we have prayed for freedom. But justice without bread and freedom without peace will not sustain us. We must ask for wisdom, not only courage." His message reflected the delicate balance the nation now faced. For families, the civil consequences were painfully intimate. Letters from fathers working abroad revealed heartbreak as they watched events unfold from a distance. One father employed as a laborer in Côte d'Ivoire wrote to his wife back home, "I am proud of what Traoré has done, but I am afraid for you and the children. If food becomes scarce, go to my brother. Do not suffer in silence." Such personal testimonies underscored how political decisions at the highest level cascaded into the smallest details of family life. And yet, through all this uncertainty, hope persisted. Citizens who had long felt powerless now felt they had a voice. Even as they faced unemployment, inflation, and shortages, many clung to the belief that the sacrifice was worth it, that future generations would live in a country no longer robbed of its wealth. Still, the uncertainty was unbearable. Would Burkina Faso withstand the pressure of sanctions? Would Traoré's government survive the internal divisions? Would the sacrifices of ordinary people be rewarded or wasted? As these questions hung heavy in the air, one final concern grew louder, both on the streets and in the corridors of power. How would the United States respond? For in a world where global powers rarely ignore challenges to their interests, the fate of Burkina Faso may now hinge on the choices made not in Ouagadougou, but in Washington, D.C. As the dust settled in Ouagadougou, the ripple effects of Traoré's actions spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In capitals across the globe, officials gathered in urgent meetings struggling to understand the full meaning of what had just happened. For decades, the arrangement had seemed unshakable. Africa provided raw materials, foreign corporations reaped the rewards, and global powers managed the balance. Traoré had just broken that pattern in front of the entire world. In Paris, lawmakers demanded answers. France, once the colonial power in Burkina Faso, found its influence slipping further than ever before. French companies had invested heavily in gold and uranium across the Sahel. Now, with their executives in custody, Paris faced humiliation. French media outlets called Traoré a radical populist, while others labeled him the African Che Guevara. For France, the arrests were more than a legal move, they were a symbolic rejection of French dominance in West Africa. In Moscow, the narrative was different. Russian commentators praised Traoré for standing up to Western exploitation, portraying him as part of a broader global shift away from old colonial powers. Analysts speculated that Moscow might increase its support for Burkina Faso, seeking to gain influence in a region where the West was losing ground. Whether symbolic or material, this alignment signaled that the arrests could tilt the balance of global alliances. But nowhere was the reaction more closely scrutinized than in Washington, D.C. For the United States, Burkina Faso is not simply a small African nation. It sits in the Sahel, a region critical to America's counterterrorism strategy. U.S. military forces operate bases in nearby countries, using them to monitor and combat extremist groups linked to al-Qaeda and ISIS. Any instability in Burkina Faso risked spilling across borders, threatening an already fragile security network. American policymakers were caught in a dilemma. On one hand, Traoré's defiance of foreign exploitation resonated with parts of the African public, making him a popular figure across the continent. Openly opposing him could alienate millions and push Burkina Faso closer to rivals like Russia or China. On the other hand, ignoring the situation could weaken U.S. influence in a region vital to its security interests. The U.S. media reflected this tension. Some outlets framed Traoré as a reckless leader endangering his people. Others highlighted him as a symbol of African self-determination, asking why the world was only concerned when corporate profits were threatened. In talk shows and opinion columns, commentators debated whether America should view Traoré as an enemy to contain or a partner to engage. For many Americans watching the news, especially older generations who lived through the Cold War, the story felt familiar. A young leader in a small nation standing up to powerful interests. Was this the beginning of a movement that could redraw global lines, or simply another flash of defiance soon to be crushed? The echoes of history were difficult to ignore. Inside Burkina Faso, ordinary citizens wondered the same thing. A shopkeeper in Ouagadougou said, "If America supports us, maybe we can survive. If America turns against us, I fear what will come." His words revealed a truth. The world could not deny the future of Burkina Faso might depend as much on Washington's choices as on Traoré's determination. Around dinner tables in the United States, where families worry about national security, some began to ask, would instability in Africa spill over into America's own safety? Could terrorist groups exploit the turmoil? These questions carried weight because the Sahel has long been a breeding ground for extremist movements that threaten U.S. allies and interests. For older Americans who value security and stability above all, this connection was not lost. As global powers calculated their next moves, the stakes became clear. Burkina Faso's decision to confront foreign exploitation was no longer a local matter. It was a test of international will. And so one question now hung over the Sahel, over Africa, and over the world itself is this: the beginning of something much larger. The arrests in Ouagadougou marked a turning point, but history teaches us that turning points are rarely stable. As Burkina Faso moved forward, the risks of chaos loomed just as strongly as the promise of change. Across the Sahel, governments watched nervously. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Chad debated whether their own people might rise up and demand justice for decades of foreign exploitation. If the idea spread, the region could face a wave of uprisings, some peaceful, others violent. For an already fragile part of Africa, that possibility carried dangerous weight. The warning signs were everywhere. Analysts predicted that within months, foreign investment in Burkina Faso could collapse by nearly half. Sanctions were a real possibility, and with them, a rapid decline in food imports and medicine. Families who celebrated Traoré's bold move might soon face empty shelves and higher prices. In villages near the border, whispers of migration grew louder. If thousands fled toward neighboring countries, humanitarian strains would multiply, creating a crisis that could destabilize the entire region. Politically, the nation was standing on a knife's edge. Traoré had secured loyalty for now, but if divisions inside the military widened, Burkina Faso could fall into another cycle of coups. International actors might exploit those fractures, using money or force to reshape the government to their liking. And once again, ordinary people would be the ones to suffer. The question then is unavoidable: is Ibrahim Traoré, the hope of Africa, Or is he a dangerous gamble that could bring even greater hardship? To many Burkinabé, he is the first leader to show real courage. To others, he is playing with fire in a region already engulfed by flames. Only time will tell which of these views will prove true. Looking ahead, one possibility stands out with chilling clarity. If the African Union and regional partners do not strengthen military and economic cooperation within the next 3 months, Burkina Faso could find itself isolated and vulnerable. In that vacuum, extremist groups already present in the Sahel could gain ground using chaos to recruit fighters and expand their reach. If that happens, the cost will not only be paid in Ouagadougou but across Africa and eventually far beyond. For the United States, this is not a distant story. Instability in the Sahel has a direct link to global security. Terrorist safe havens in this region could threaten allies, disrupt trade, and endanger American lives. This is why the question of Traoré's future is not only about Burkina Faso, it is about whether the world will allow a fragile hope to collapse into chaos. And so the conclusion is not truly an ending, but an open door. Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads with one path leading to sovereignty and dignity and the other to hardship and disorder. The choice will depend on leadership, on resilience, and on whether the international community acts with wisdom or indifference. If this story has reached your heart, do not let it pass in silence. Reflect on what it means for justice, for dignity, and for the kind of world we leave to our children. If you believe that Africa deserves more than exploitation, let your thoughts be known. And if you believe that faith still has power in our world, pray for Burkina Faso, for Africa, and for all nations standing on the edge of uncertainty. May God bless Africa, the land of strength, hope, and unbreakable spirit.